Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel and to a new video. It's nice to be here again. I've been starting to slowly getting better now and I feel comfortable enough now to shoot videos. I will still need some days to get back to 100%, but I'm on the way to a good recovery and I'm really thrilled to be back here on the camera. Now in this video I want to actually address something that has been asked in the comments and also via email a lot, and that is about disk partitioning for your system. So I've already done a video about this in the past, but I will go a little bit deeper in this one, and I'm gonna give you an overlook on partitioning your disks, whether you are on a UEFI machine or on an AMD Legacy machine. Now, as you probably know, we have two types of machine. We have UEFI machines and legacy machines. Now, if you have a new computer or newer than 2010, chances are you are probably using a UEFI machine. If it's an old computer, chances are you probably have a MBR machine or a legacy system. Now, when you boot up the Arch ISO, for example, as you can see here on this virtual machine, it is a UEFI machine. It says on the first line, Arch Linux install medium x86-64 UEFI. And this is using the systemd boot. Now, if I switch over to the MBR machine here, you will see the splash logo is completely different. And you can see there it says on the bottom of the screen, boot the Arch Linux install medium on BIOS. And it's using actually the sys Linux bootloader for the BIOS system. Now we're going to have a look at both systems and how we can partition them. Now what I'm going to show you in this video is not true only for Arch, it's actually true for any Linux distribution, because partitioning the disk is the same for all distros. Now let me go back to my UEFI machine. We're going to start with UEFI first, and then I'm going to switch over to the legacy machine. Now let me start the system here. Before I do this, actually let me type E and go to the end of the string to type in video equal 1920 per 1080, just so that the virtual machine picks up my screen resolution here, and hit enter. And we're just gonna wait here until the machine boots up, which is gonna take a couple of seconds, and we're gonna taking care of our disk. So here we are in the UEFI machine, and the first thing I need to do here is to actually increase the font sizes so that you can see better. So let me type in set font ter-132n and hit enter. And you can see we have bigger fonts. So let me change also my key maps, because otherwise I will be making typos the whole time. And that's the one I have here. There you go. And so now we are ready to work. So let's type in first thing lsblk, because we want to find out the name of our disk. So you can see here I have only one disk in this machine, is called VDA. Now, this is actually the disk we need to partition. And as we've seen before, this is a UEFI machine. So on a UEFI machine, it is mandatory to use a GPT label or to create a GUID partition table, GPT. This is mandatory for UEFI machines. So we don't have many choices here. We just have to use GPT. Now we can create our partitions using different tools. You can create it with fdisk, you can create it with parted, you can create it also with cfdisk, you can create it also with gdisk, and so on. There are many tools we can use. Now, the one I use usually here on UEFI machine is gdisk. And that's because it was actually conceived for GPT partitions. You can use also fdisk for that, although actually fdisk was known to have some issues with GPT labels in the past, which I believe now have been fixed. But we have gdisk, and I'm going to use that actually to create my GPT partitions, because it was created to do that. And afterwards, I'm going to show you another tool as well. So let's go ahead and type in gdisk /dev/VDA. So we're going to basically create our partitions on our VDA disk, and then we can hit enter. Now this is a brand new disk, so there is not much else to do here, and we cannot create any other label than a GPT label on this disk. So I'm gonna be fine with this, and I can start right away. But if you have already a list of partitions and you would like to create a new partition table, you can type in O here and hit enter, and you will create a new GPT partition table for the disk. Now, if you don't know this, you can also type in here the question mark for the help, and it's going to show you what you can do here from this prompt. So what I showed you before, you can see there with the O, create a new empty GUID partition table, or GPT. So if you need to do that, go ahead and do that. So I'm going to do that as well. I don't need to, but I'm just going to show you to you. So O and hit enter. And this option deletes all partitions and create a new protected MBR, which is fine. So we can just hit Y here, and we have now our new label in place. Now, For the UEFI system, we can partition in several ways. We have two partitions which are mandatory. One is the EFI partition, where the grub bootloader will be installed later. And we have also the root partition, which is also mandatory. Now, you might ask, what about swap and what about the home partition? Well, the home partition is actually not mandatory, it's optional. And a lot of people like to use that because if you have a home partition separated from the root partition, then when there is a problem with the system, you can just reinstall the system on the root partition and all the data in your home partition will be untouched. It really comes down with your workflow though. If you're using a lot of cloud data and you don't need a home partition, you can also skip it. It's really up to you. Now, we could create also the swap partition, but this is really up to you here, because if you have a system which has a lot of RAM, like 8 GB or more, you could go ahead and create a swap file, which is going to save some space on your disk. Or if you want, you can create also the ZRAM, as we created also in the last monthly installation of Arch, which is going to use some of the RAM to create swap space, basically. Now, it's really up to you. If you have 4 GB or less, probably a swap partition is better. So in this case, I'm going to show you how you can create all of these partitions. And then I'm going to show you after how you can create them with another tool as well. So to create a new partition here, let's type in N for new and hit enter. Now the partition number is by default the number 1, so that's fine. We can just hit enter here. And you can see now we can select the first sector. So you can see the default there is 2048, and that's because it's going to leave basically a little space before creating the first partition on the disk. And so I'm going to accept that and hit enter. And the last sector defines the size of this partition. So this is actually going to be the EFI partition where the bootloader is going to be installed later. So I'm going to create a EFI partition here by typing in +300 megabytes. You can do it also less if you want to, or more. It's really up to you. 300, it's for me a good middle size. And then I can hit enter. Now we need to actually select also the code for this partition. Now 8300, what you see there is the Linux file system type. And that's not what we want. We want to have the EFI system partition type. Now I know the code, but if you don't know it, you can type in here capital L and hit enter. And as you can see that it says type search string or enter to show all code. So you can hit enter here and it's going to show you all the codes, or you can narrow down the search by typing, for example, EFI. And as you can see, it says EF00 equals to EFI system partition, and that's the one we want. So I'm going to type in EF00 and hit enter. And the partition is now created. Now, next, I'm going to create a swap partition. So N for new. Partition number 2 is fine. The partition first sector starts at 616448, which is the default. It's basically going to follow the one we had before, so it's going to be fine for me. And the last sector again defines the size of the swap. So in my case, I'm going to do a very small swap partition. So I'm going to create a 1 GB swap partition and hit enter. And again, same thing for the code. So I don't know the code for the swap, so we can type in capital L again. And I'm going to search for swap. And as you can see here, we have several ones, but the one I'm looking for is the first one, 8200 Linux swap. So I'm going to type in 8200 in here and hit enter. And the partition type has been changed to Linux swap. So let's go ahead and create our root partition. So N for new. Partition number 3 is fine. So I can hit enter here. The first sector is also fine. I'm just going to accept the default here. And the last sector again defines the size of this partition. So for this partition, I'm going to create a plus, let's say 20 gigabytes root partition and hit enter. Now for the code, this time is going to be fine because it's going to be a Linux file system. So I'm just going to accept the default here by hitting enter. And as you can see there, change type of partition to Linux file system. So next, let's create our home partition. That's going to be our last one. So N for new. Partition number 4 is fine. The first sector is also fine. And this time I'm going to accept also the default for the last sector because I want this partition to take the remainder of the disk. And the file system is going to be also 8300. It's going to be the same one as the root partition. And again, change the partition to Linux file system. So what we can do now, we can write all these changes to the disk because nothing is written to the disk until we run the write command, which we can do with the W. And as you can see here, it says final checks complete, about to write GPT data. This will overwrite existing partitions. So do you want to proceed? You would typically type in Y here and hit enter, and your disk will be partitioned. Now in my case though, I'm going to type in N. And the reason is because I want to show you also another tool that you can use to create GPT partitions. So I'm going to hit enter here after the N. And I'm going to exit gdisk here with Control C. There you go. So let me clean up the terminal, and this time I'm going to type in actually cgdisk /dev/vda. So cgdisk is basically the corresponding utility of fdisk, but for GPT labels. Now, it's not such a popular tool, but it's there, and I just wanted to show it to you in this video because it's actually meant to create GPT partition tables using a little more graphical tool like fdisk. So we can hit enter now. And as you can see, it says here, warning, non-GPT or damage is detected. That's fine. We can just press any key to continue here. And you can see here the type of fdisk layout that we have. We have our disk here with the free space, and on the bottom we have the options we need to create our partitions. So new is already selected, so I'm just going to hit it here. And as you can see, the first sector for the first partition is the default 2048, which is going to leave again a little space on the beginning of the disk, and that's fine for me. The size in sectors basically again is the size of this first partition. This is going to be the UEFI partition again, so I'm going to type in here plus 300 megabytes again and hit enter. Now the code, we could use the same method here by typing in capital L, but now I know the code, which is EF00 for the UEFI system partition. And as you can see, it says current partition name is nothing. If you want, you can give it a name. This is actually something that we get here in cgdisk. So I'm going to call actually this partition UEFI and hit enter. And as you can see there, it says partition number 1, 300 megabytes, UEFI system partition name UEFI. Now we go down to the free space and create our swap partition. So we hit new, and first sector is going to be fine again. The size is going to be again, I would say 1 gigabyte, that's enough, and hit enter. Now the code for the swap we saw before is 8200 and hit enter. We can give it a name, I'm going to call it swap and hit enter. And that's it. So we can go down again and hit new. And we're going to create again our root partition. So the default for first sector is fine. The size in sectors, I'm going to go again with 20 gigabytes here. And the code is actually 8300, so that's fine. We can just accept it. And the partition name is going to be, in this case, root, and hit enter. There you go. Now we can create our home partition. So we hit new again. And we accept the default for the first sector and also for the size in sectors because it's going to take the rest of the disk. And the code is also going to be fine. And I'm going to call this partition home and then hit enter. So there you go. We have our 4 partitions. Now again, we need to write these changes to the disk here. So we can go down to write here and hit enter. And are you sure you want to write the partition table to the disk? Yes or no? I will type yes this time and hit enter. And it's going to take a moment to do that. There you go. The operation was successful and we can quit. And now if I type in lsblk, you can see we have there our 4 partitions ready to go. Now don't forget, in this kind of partitioning with the UEFI system, you will actually have to install the grub bootloader when you will install it. On the VDA1 partition, in this case, your disk name will be different, so you will have to replace the name, of course, of the partition, but it's going to be the UEFI partition. Now, you will have to mount the UEFI partition under /boot or /boot/UEFI, and when you will run your grub install command, you will have to run it with that directory, which is going to install on the UEFI partition. So this is all there is to it for UEFI systems. It's pretty simple and it's pretty straight. Now I would say let's jump over to our MBR system. So here we are on the BIOS ISO, and let me hit the tab key here to edit the options. I'm gonna again give the video parameter so that it's gonna pick up the correct video resolution, and then I can just hit enter to start the system. So it's gonna take a moment again here to boot up the ISO. And then we're gonna see how we can partition actually the disk on a legacy system. And this is gonna be slightly different because we have a different disk label. We have also different ways on how we can do it as well. So again, let me type in set font ter-132n to increase the font size. There you go. Clean up the terminal and type in load keys again to load keyboard layout and hit enter. There you go. So let me type in again lsblk, and as you can see here we have VDA, again the same disk. This time it's going to be a legacy machine. So we have again here several tools that we can use to partition our disk on a legacy machine. One of the most popular ones is fdisk, and the other most popular one is cfdisk. Now these are the two tools I'm going to show you in this video. Now how about the partition scheme? Okay, so this is also something very peculiar for legacy systems because we have two different kinds of layouts that we can use. So by default, actually a legacy machine is going to use the DOS disk label. And in a DOS disk label, you would create usually a swap partition if you need one, a root partition, which is mandatory, and also a home partition, which is optional, but you can do it also here on a legacy system if you want to, of course. Now, it's very simple. So you would have to create a swap, root, and home, and you would then install the grab bootloader on the disk itself. So you would not have a partition where to install the bootloader here. So this is one, but actually on legacy systems, depending on your system and depending also on your motherboard, you could also partition the disk on a legacy system using a GPT label. In that case though, the partitioning scheme is going to be slightly different. I'm going to show you both approaches in this video, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to use fdisk here to create actually a standard DOS disk label, and later I'm going to use cfdisk to create actually the GPT label with the specific layout. Now let's go ahead and type in fdisk/dev/vda and hit enter. Now again, here you can see changes will remain in memory only until we write them to the disk. This is very important. Now we have also the very useful M here for the help. You can see here it's giving us some commands that we can use. You can see also in the last paragraph there, create a new label. So G is going to create a GPT partition table, and O is going to create a new DOS partition table. So it's really up to you. If you have a new disk, normally it's going to create automatically a DOS disk label. But if you have already some partitions and you want to create a new one, you can type in here O again. Don't confuse this with the gdisk utility, because on the gdisk utility, the O option is going to create a GPT label. So we can hit enter here. And as you can see, it's created a new DOS disk label with its own disk identifier. Now, we don't need to create any boot partition here or any EFI partition here. So we can just go straight and create our swap partition. So N for new. And as you can see, we have here the choice between primary and extended. Now, as you probably already know, the DOS disk label accepts only 4 primary partitions. So if you need to have more than 4, you would have to go ahead and create 3 primaries and then create the 4th one as an extended, where you can create multiple partitions afterwards. In this case though, I'm going to create a swap partition, a root partition, and a home partition only. So that's going to be enough for the primary partition. So P is the default here, so it's fine. I can just hit enter. Partition number 1 is fine, it's a default. First sector is also fine. Again, it's going to create the first partition at the 2048 position, which is not at the beginning of the disk, which is fine. And the last sector, again, I'm going to create here the size of the swap. Now, this is going to be up to you how much swap you want to have. It's really going to depend on how much RAM you have on your system. So if you have 1 GB or 2 GB of RAM, I would go ahead and create at least double of that with swap. So 2 GB or 4 GB respectively of swap. If you have 4 GB of RAM, you want to create swap, you could create a 4 GB swap. If you have 8 GB, probably you can go ahead and create a swap file, or you could create also a small swap partition as well, like a 2 GB, for example. Now I'm going to create in this case a +2 GB swap partition and then hit enter. Now you can see here it's telling us create a new partition 1 of type Linux and size of 2 GB. And then it's just telling me continue. Well, actually I want to change the type of this partition. So how do we do this? Well, again, M and hit enter. And you can see there under generic, it says the T option is for changing the partition type. So I'm going to type in here T and hit enter. Now the partition 1 is selected already, so that's fine. Now I don't know the code for the swap, so I can type in here the capital L And I see some of these, but not all of them, because some of them are cut on the top. But you can see here on the bottom of the screen where it says aliases, we have swap as a code 82. So that's the one I'm looking for. So 82 is the code. And as you can see now, the partition type has been changed to Linux swap. Now we can go ahead and create our root partition, which is mandatory. So we can hit N here. And again, it's going to be a primary partition, so P, or just accept the default. Partition number 2 is fine. The first sector is going to be fine. It's going to pick up from the last partition here. And the last sector, again, is the size of the root partition. In this case, I'm going to create a plus 20 gigabytes partition. And it's a type of Linux, which is actually fine. I don't need to change this because it's a root partition. So I don't need to change the type. And I'm going to create again now the home partition. So N for new. The primary is fine. So I'm just going to accept the default here. Default partition number 3 is also fine. The first sector is also fine. Again, it's going to pick up from the last position. And the last sector is going to use now the rest of the disk, which is fine for me. So I'm just going to accept the default here. And now we have our 3 partitions, and you can see the last one is 28 gigabytes in size. Now we need to write these changes to the disk, so we can type in W here for writing, and you can see the partition table has been altered. Notice that in this case, it has not been asked for a confirmation. So before you do that, just make sure that you partition the disk correctly. Now, this is one way we can do it. Now let's go ahead and do something different. So let's clean up the terminal and type in this time cfdisk/dev/vda. We're going to use cfdisk for this second example and hit enter. Now you can see here on the top, actually it's saying that the label is a DOS disk label. Now, how about if we want to actually partition our legacy machine with the GPT partition table? How do we do it? Well, there is no actually really a way to do it from here. We cannot change the disk label of the disk from here. So what we can do here, we can type in here quit, or we can hit quit, better said, and go back to fdisk again. And as you remember, the command for creating a new GPT partition table on a legacy machine is the G option, and hit enter. Now we can write this change, so we can just type in W. And if we go back again to the cfdisk this time, you can see the label has been changed to GPT, and we have our free disk basically, and we can now partition the disk with a GPT partition label. Now the GPT partition label here on a legacy system requires a slightly different type of partitioning, in that you need to create actually a boot partition as well and make it bootable. So what I'm going to do in this case, I'm going to create actually a boot partition, again a swap partition, a root partition, and a home partition as well. So let's go ahead and hit new here. And partition size. So for the BIOS boot partition, so-called BIOS boot partition, the ArchWiki recommends a 1 megabytes size. Now you can make it also slightly bigger if you want to. I'm going to go here for 100 megabytes. So I'm going to type in +100, capital M, and hit enter. Now I'm going to go to type here because we need to change the type. This is not a Linux file system as it says on top. So you can see here on the top, the fourth option here, it's BIOS boot. And this is the one we need to select. So I'm just going to select it. There you go. And you can see there the type is now BIOS boot. Now we can go down to free space and create our swap partition. So we hit new again. And again, I'm going to create a +2, actually just 2 gigabytes. And hit enter here. I'm going to go again to type, and this time I'm going to choose Linux swap, which is just here, and I'm going to create now my root partition. So N for new, and for that I'm going to do a 20 gigabytes partition again, and Linux file system is fine this time, so I don't need to change the type. And I go down to free space here, hit new again, and accept the default, and now we have our 4 partitions. So what we can do here, we can hit write. And are you sure you want to write the changes to the disk? So I'm going to type in yes and hit enter. And there you go, the partition table has been altered. So we can quit from cfdisk and type in lsblk. And as you can see there, we have our 4 partitions. Now, these are the two ways that you can actually partition the disk here using a DOS disk label or a GPT label. Now, keep in mind, as I said before, on a legacy system, it's going to really be up to the system you have. I've seen some systems where it's actually recommended also to create a boot partition for DOS disk label and make it bootable. For example, let me show it to you. So I'll type in here fdisk again, and then /dev/vda to create again DOS disk label, so O, and write, there you go. And if we go back to cfdisk again this time, you can see we have a DOS disk label, so I can create a new partition here. I will make it again, let's say 100 megabytes, and it's going to be a primary partition. And you can see on the left side here of the screen we have bootable, so I can make it bootable like this here. And you can see it has the boot flag now. And then you can go ahead and create the other partition. So it's really up to the system you're using to know exactly which kind of partition table you need for your legacy machine. So UEFI machine is pretty straight. You have to have the EFI system partition where to install the grab bootloader. This is mandatory. On a legacy system, there are 2 or 3 different ways on how you can actually create your partitioning layout. Usually, the normal one I showed you at the beginning here with the fdisk utility, it's the one that works. But if you encounter any problem, you can try out also the other partitioning schemes. So this is pretty much everything I wanted to show you in this video. If you have any question, let me know in the comments below. I will try to answer you as soon as I can. And if you like the video, please hit the thumbs up and subs to the channel if you haven't already. Subs always help me out. And if you want to support my work, you can do so by becoming a Patreon, or if you want to, you can also donate via PayPal through my website as well. Thank you so much for watching the video, guys, and I'll see you very soon in the next one.